The message came at 6:14 in the morning. It arrived on every screen, every channel, and every open frequency across the known galaxy at the exact same time. The Volkai Dominion had always liked doing things in a way that made a point. They wanted every species watching. They wanted every ambassador, every council member, and every frightened little civilization out there to see exactly what happened when someone got in their way. The hall of the Galactic Conclave was enormous. It had to be. It held representatives from over 60 species, all of them gathered under a ceiling made of transparent alloy that looked out into open space. Stars burned quietly above them as the Volkai High Executor walked to the center podium. He was tall. He had pale, hard-looking skin like old bone, and 12 eyes arranged in 2 curved rows across his wide face. He moved slowly because he did not need to rush. He had never needed to rush for anything in his life. He placed a single data card on the podium. A holographic star map rose from it and filled the room. The map showed the galaxy, familiar to everyone present. Then a small section near the outer edge lit up in red. One solar system, one small, yellowish star, one blue planet sitting in the 3rd orbit. Earth. Ambassador Nari was sitting at the human delegation table when the map appeared. She was a small woman with short dark hair and a calm face that gave away nothing. She had been the human voice at the conclave for 9 years. She had sat through arguments, treaties, and border disputes. She had smiled at species who looked down at her and shaken hands with ones who thought humanity was barely worth the trouble of acknowledging. She was very good at keeping her face still. The High Executor spoke in Volkai, and the translation system running in every delegate's earpiece turned his words into their own language almost instantly. He said that the human territory was an obstacle. He said Earth sat directly in the path of the Dominion's planned expansion corridor. He said that the Volkai had been patient for a long time, and that patience had now run out. He presented the formal declaration of war in clear, simple language. Humanity had 72 cycles to surrender completely, to open their space to Volkai control, and to accept terms that would be delivered upon their compliance. Or, he said, there would be nothing left to accept terms. He picked up his data card, turned, and walked back to his seat without looking at Nari once. The room was very quiet. Other ambassadors glanced at Nari sideways. A few looked at her with something close to pity. The Volkai had never lost a war. They had absorbed 16 civilizations into their dominion over 400 years. Some of those civilizations had been far larger and far older than humanity. None of them had survived with their independence. Most had not survived at all. Nari looked at the red glow still sitting over Earth's solar system on the holographic map. Then she raised her hand and asked, in a polite and even voice, whether she could be excused to relay the message to her government. The conclave chair said yes. She walked out of the hall at the same calm pace she always walked. The doors closed behind her. She went to the small private communications room assigned to the human delegation, sat down, and opened an encrypted channel to Earth. It was early morning in Seoul. The UEDF command center sat deep underground, beneath the Old Han River district, buried under so many layers of concrete and shielded alloy that not even a direct orbital strike would reach it on the first hit. The walls were lined with screens. The center of the room was taken up by a long table covered in holographic displays showing fleet positions, energy readings, and star charts that most civilians would never get to see. Commander General Yuna was standing at the far end of the table when the message came in. She was not a large woman, but she carried herself in a way that made the room feel smaller when she was in it. Her hair was pulled back tight. Her uniform had no decorations on it because she had never seen the point of decorations. The people in this room knew what she had done. She did not need metal pins to remind them. Diho stood to her left. He was her second in command, a broad-shouldered man who had come up through the infantry before anyone thought to put him in front of a strategy table. He was the kind of man who could look at a battlefield and see it the way most people looked at a chessboard. He read the declaration aloud from the screen in front of him in a flat, steady voice. The room went quiet when he finished. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Every officer in that room had spent years preparing for a moment exactly like this one, and now that it was here, there was a strange stillness to it, like the second before a thunderstorm breaks. Yuna set her coffee cup down on the edge of the table. She looked at the message on the screen. She looked at the Voakai seal at the top of it, red and formal. She looked at the countdown timer in the corner, already running, 72 cycles ticking down in small, steady numbers. She breathed out slowly through her nose. Then, very quietly, she smiled. It was not a happy smile exactly. It was the smile of someone who had been sitting in a waiting room for 30 years and had just heard their name called. Finally, she said. And the room exploded into motion. Not panic, not shouting. Clean, fast, practiced motion. Officers moved to their stations. Screens changed. Channels opened. Every person in that room had a job, and they had rehearsed it so many times that their hands moved before their minds had to think. Diho was already pulling up fleet coordinates. The ships out beyond Pluto, sitting dark and cold and silent in the deep black, were receiving the activation signal. One by one, across the outer solar system, powered-down warships began to wake up. Running lights blinked on. Engines warmed from nothing to a low thrum. Hundreds of them, ship after ship coming alive in the dark. Yuna walked to the main display. The fleet markers were lighting up across the screen like stars appearing at dusk. She pressed the open channel button. Her voice went out to every ship, every crew, every soldier who had been waiting just as long as she had. All units, she said, they came to us. Let's remind them why that was a mistake. Hana found the anomaly at 4 in the morning. She had not slept. She never slept much when there was something in the data that did not sit right, and right now almost everything in the data did not sit right. She was the best xenolinguist in the UEDF Intelligence Division, which meant she spent most of her time listening to things that were not meant to be heard. She had a small desk in a room full of servers and cold air and the quiet hum of machines working through the night. Empty cups were stacked beside her keyboard. Her eyes were red at the edges. The anomaly was buried inside a Volkai Fleet Command transmission, scrambled and bounced across 3 relay points to make it hard to trace. She had been picking it apart for 2 hours. When she finally got it clean and ran it through the translation engine, she leaned back in her chair and read it twice. It was a message between 2 Volkai fleet admirals. They were not talking about strategy. They were not talking about weapon loadouts or approach vectors. They were asking each other why Earth had not gone quiet yet. The Volkai had expected silence within 6 cycles of the declaration. They had expected the human signals to drop, the way signals always dropped when a civilization realized what was coming and the fear set in. Instead, Earth's electromagnetic output had tripled since the message was delivered. Signals were going out in every direction. Energy readings around the human solar system were climbing. The Volkai admirals did not understand what they were looking at. Hana smiled at her screen. She picked up her comm and called Diho. He answered on the second ring. She told him what she had found. There was a short pause on his end. "Send it to command," he said, "and get some sleep." She sent it to command. She did not get any sleep. From the outside, Earth looked almost normal. Civilian news channels were running. Shops were open. People were going to work. There were no soldiers in the streets, no sirens, no visible signs that the planet had just received a declaration of war from the largest military power in the known galaxy. A person standing on any ordinary street corner would have had no idea that anything was happening at all. That was entirely on purpose. The mobilization was not happening on the streets. It was happening underneath them, above them, and far beyond them in the dark of space. Deep-level manufacturing plants that officially produced agricultural equipment switched their lines over without public announcement. orbital platforms that officially monitored whether patterns began rotating to new positions. A string of research stations out past Mars went completely dark to outside sensors, not because they stopped working, but because they stopped wanting to be seen. Myra had been on the bridge of the UES, undying for 6 hours when Tiang finally told her to stop staring at the viewport. She was 24 years old and she had been assigned to the Undying 3 months ago as a junior bridge officer. She had trained for 4 years. She had scored high enough on every test they put in front of her to earn a posting on a ship like this one. But training and scoring and posting were one thing. Sitting on the bridge of the largest warship in the human fleet while that fleet was waking up all around her in the dark was something else entirely. The Undying was long and dark-hulled, and built in a way that did not look like anything the Conclave's shipbuilding guides would have recognized. Most species built warships that looked like warships, with visible weapon arrays and heavy forward armor and shapes that communicated clearly what they were. The Undying did not look like anything in particular. It looked like a piece of space that had been folded wrong. Tiang stood at the center of the bridge. He was not a tall man, but he was a very still one, the kind of still that came from spending 20 years making decisions that other people's lives depended on. He watched the fleet markers appear on his display one by one and said nothing for a long time. Myra finally asked the question she had been turning over since the activation signal came through. "How many ships are out here?" she asked. "Enough," Tiang said. She looked at the display. She counted the markers until she lost count. She stopped asking questions and started paying attention instead, which was probably what he wanted her to do. Diho brought Myra down to the weapons deck later that day. It was Tiang's idea. He thought she needed to understand what she was part of before the shooting started, and Diho agreed. The weapons deck was deep in the ship, past 3 security checkpoints, in a part of the hull that was wrapped in so much dampening material it felt quieter than anywhere else on board. Sung-ho was there waiting for them. He was a short, stocky man with grease on his forearms, and the look of someone who had not fully separated himself from whatever problem he had been thinking about before they arrived. He shook Myra's hand and immediately began talking. He showed her the primary weapon systems, not in a proud way exactly, more the way a person showed someone a tool they had spent a long time making sure would work. He explained, in plain language, what each system did, and why it was different from anything the Volkai or any other species in the Conclave had seen before. Every other species in the galaxy had built their weapons technology from a shared foundation. Hundreds of years ago, the Conclave had circulated basic defense and propulsion frameworks as a gesture of unity. Almost everyone had used them. Almost everyone had built upward from the same starting point. It meant that across the galaxy, weapons and shields and propulsion systems were all variations on the same original design. Humanity had looked at that framework, studied it politely, and then gone home and built something completely different. "Why?" Myra asked. Sung-ho looked at her like the answer was obvious. "Because if everyone builds from the same base, everyone's weapons work on everyone else's shields," he said. "We didn't want that. We wanted our own." He walked her past a row of launcher assemblies that were unlike anything in any Conclave weapons catalog. He explained how the targeting system worked by thinking about a problem the way a human soldier would think about it, not the way a computer running Conclave standard algorithms would. Chaotic, adaptive, hard to predict. Every other species in this galaxy evolved away from violence, Sung-ho said, patting the side of one of the launchers like it was an old friend. "We didn't. We just got better at it." Myra stood there in the quiet of the weapons deck and felt something shift inside her. Not fear. Something heavier than fear and more serious. She was beginning to understand what this fleet was. She was beginning to understand what humanity had quietly been building for 30 years, while the rest of the galaxy looked at Earth and saw something small. The Volkai advance scouts found the fleet formation at the edge of the solar system at the end of that same long day. Their sensors swept the area, registered the contacts, and then went on registering them for a long time because the number kept being too high to process quickly. 400 warships, sitting in a deep space battle configuration so large that the scout vessel's pilot had to widen his sensor range 3 times before he had the full picture. Dark-hulled, powered up, waiting. He transmitted the report back to Volkai Fleet Command. The channel went quiet for 6 full minutes. Then a response came back, short, and with something in the phrasing that the Volkai almost never put in military communications. Uncertainty. They were already ready, the message said. Back on Earth, in the underground command center, Yuna read the intercepted transmission that Hana had pulled from Volkai channels. She set it down on the table and looked at the star map in front of her, at the 400 bright markers sitting patient and still beyond Pluto. She picked her coffee back up. "Good," she said quietly. "Let them think about that for a while." They came in a straight line. That was the first thing Myra noticed when the Volkai warning fleet appeared on the bridge display. 200 ships, moving in a tight, organized formation, pointed directly at the human fleet like a finger being pressed into a chest. It was deliberate. It was meant to look the way it looked. The Volkai had been doing this for 400 years, and they knew exactly what the sight of 200 warships moving in perfect order did to the people watching them come. Myra watched them come. Her hands were flat on her station console. Her breathing was steady because she was making it steady on purpose. Tiang stood at the center of the bridge and looked at the display for a long time without speaking. The rest of the bridge crew worked quietly around him, running checks, confirming readings, doing the 100 small necessary things that had to happen before a battle. Nobody was talking above a low murmur. The Undying felt like a room where everyone was thinking very hard. Myra looked at Tiang. He had not moved. He was watching the formation the way someone watched a fire, steady and without hurry. She asked him if he was afraid. He was quiet for a moment. He did not look away from the display. "No," he said, "I'm focused. There's a difference." She turned back to her console and tried to understand the difference. By the time the Volkai fleet crossed into engagement range, she thought maybe she did. The Volkai opened with their standard opening move. It was called a particle barrage in the Conclave's military literature. Long range, widespread, designed to hit shields hard and fast and knock propulsion systems offline before the enemy could respond. It had worked on every civilization the Volkai had ever fought. It worked because almost every civilization in the galaxy used the same basic shield technology, the same framework that the Conclave had shared openly centuries ago. The Volkai knew exactly how much power it took to break those shields. They had done the math so many times it was automatic. The barrage hit the human fleet across a wide front. Hundreds of energy impacts, bright and violent on the display screens, lighting up the dark between the two fleets like a storm. Myra gripped the edge of her console. The Undying shook once, a low rolling shudder, and then steadied. Damage reports came in from across the fleet. Sung-Ho's voice came over the internal channel from the weapons deck, calm and almost bored sounding. "Shields holding," he said. "All ships reporting the same. They tickled us." Myra stared at her screen. The fleet was intact. Every ship was intact. The most powerful opening strike in the Volkai military playbook had crossed hundreds of thousands of kilometers of space and done almost nothing. On the Volkai command frequency, which Hana was monitoring from the intelligence station back on Earth and feeding live to Fleet Command, there was a pause, a long one. The kind of pause that meant the people on the other end were looking at their own readings and not believing them. Tiang allowed himself a very small, very brief smile. Then it was gone. "All wings," he said into the open fleet channel. "Execute pattern 7. The human fleet split. That was the second thing the Volkai had never seen. One moment there was a single large formation sitting across from them, organized and readable. The next moment it was coming apart, breaking into dozens of separate strike groups moving in different directions at different speeds, spreading out across a massive volume of space in patterns that looked, from the outside, like chaos. They were not chaos. Diho was running the engagement from a command position aboard a mid-fleet carrier, watching the tactical display with the same expression he used for everything, the flat, concentrated look of a man turning a problem over in his mind. The movement of every strike group was mapped in his head. He knew where each one was going and why. The pattern was built from thousands of years of human combat history, from infantry tactics and naval strategy, and every hard lesson humanity had ever learned about how to fight something bigger than itself. You did not stand in front of something bigger and hit it straight on. You made it turn. You made it spread out trying to follow you. You made it fold inward on itself looking for a center that kept moving. The Volkai fleet did exactly what Diho expected. Their formation, built for coordinated forward engagement, began to compress and rotate, trying to track the spreading human strike groups. Ships moved to cover gaps. Command vessels pulled back toward the center. Their targeting systems swept back and forth across too many contacts moving in too many directions. They could not get clean locks. Their entire targeting doctrine was built around fighting formations that held their shape. The human fleet had no shape. It had intent, and intent was much harder to shoot at. Myra was receiving position updates so fast her screen was blurring. She filtered down to her own strike group's data and focused on that, tracking the 3 ships moving with the Undying, watching the gap between them and their assigned Volkai targets close steadily. Tiang's voice came over the bridge channel, still at the same even volume he used for everything. "Sungho, you're clear." Sungho's reply came back immediately. "About time." The human fleet opened fire all at once. Myra had read about fleet engagements in her training. She had studied them, run simulations, looked at the old records from Earth's own naval wars. She thought she had a reasonable picture of what it would look and feel like. She did not. The simulations were not loud enough and they were not bright enough, and they did not have the low physical pressure that moved through the hull every time the Undying's main guns fired. The weapons were not elegant. They were not the clean, precise beams that most conclave military forces used. They were heavy and blunt, and they hit the way a door being kicked off its hinges hit, all at once and with total commitment. Volkai hulls were built to absorb the kind of punishment their own weapons, and the weapons of every species they had ever fought could deliver. They were not built for this. The first wave of strikes tore through 3 Volkai heavy vessels before their damage systems could even register the hits. Secondary explosions rolled through 2 more. Strike groups all across the engagement zone were reporting similar results. The battle lasted 40 minutes. When it was over, Myra sat at her station and looked at the debris field on the display. Pieces of Volkai ships drifted slowly across the space where the formation had been. 11 vessels had broken and run, their drives pushed to maximum, heading back the way they had come. Everything else was debris. 200 ships. 11 survived. Diho pulled the casualty numbers for the human fleet and read them quietly. 3 ships destroyed, 9 damaged, all repairable. He sent the numbers to Yuna without a comment. On the bridge of the Undying, nobody cheered. Tiang stood at the center of the room and looked at the display for a long time, and then he asked for a full damage report and started going through it line by line. The crew went back to work. Myra sat still for a moment. She had expected to feel something simple. Pride, maybe, or relief. What she felt was harder to name. It sat somewhere behind her sternum, and it was heavy and serious and had no easy word attached to it. She thought about the 11 ships that had run. She thought about them carrying their report back to whoever sent them. She thought about what happened next. In the Volkai Command Center, deep inside their advanced fleet carrier, the High Executor received the battle report from the surviving ships. He read it once. He read it again. He set it down on the surface of his command table and looked at it the way a person looked at something they had found on the ground and could not identify. He had never read a report like this in 400 years of warfare. He was quiet for a long time. Around him, his staff waited. Nobody spoke. Outside the viewports, the stars were the same as they had always been. Nothing had changed and everything had changed, and the high executor sat in his chair and tried to find a word for what he was feeling. He found one eventually. He said it out loud in Voakai, low and slow, and later, when Hana translated the recording of the room, she would sit back from her screen and laugh quietly to herself. What he had said, translated simply, was, "What are these things?" The Voakai did not wait long. 20 cycles after the warning fleet was destroyed, the full HFY War armada began to move. Every sensor array humanity had placed in deep space picked it up at the same time. The readings came into the command center in Seoul in a steady stream, and Diho stood at the main display and watched the numbers climb and kept his face very still while he did it. 1,400 vessels. It was the largest single military force assembled in the modern galactic era. Species across the conclave watched the armada depart on their own long-range sensors and went very quiet. A few began drafting messages to Earth. Not warnings, not offers of help, condolences. They were the kind of messages you wrote when something terrible was already decided and all that was left was to acknowledge it. Nari, still at the conclave station, received 3 of them before the day was out. She read each one, replied politely, and did not mention that back home, Yuna had stopped watching the armada's departure and had already moved on to the next phase of something she had been planning for 20 years. Yuna called Diho into the private briefing room off the main floor that evening. She pulled up a star map on the small table between them and pointed to the route the Voakai armada was taking. It was a long route. Deep space transit between Voakai territory and the human solar system took time, even for a fleet moving at full speed. They had cycles before contact. Then she moved her finger to a different part of the map, not the armada's route, behind it. "They've emptied their home system to build that fleet," she said. "Every heavy combat vessel they have is in that armada. What's left behind is logistics, supply stations, fuel depots, communication relays." She looked at Diho. "The chain that keeps 1,400 ships fed and connected across light years of space." Diho looked at the map for a moment. "You want to cut the chain," he said. "I want to burn it," Yuna said. She told him the plan. A separate fleet, assembled from ships that had been sitting in dark space even further out than the main force, ships so cold and still that even the Voakai's best sensors had never found them. That fleet would not go to meet the armada. It would go the other way, into Voakai territory, directly to the infrastructure that was keeping their 1,400 ships alive and coordinated across the void. Diho would command the strike fleet. Tiang and the Undying would lead it. "If the armada loses its supply lines while it's in transit," Diho said slowly, "it starts to die on its own." "And we don't have to fight 1,400 ships," Yuna said. "We just have to hold what we have long enough for them to fall apart." Diho looked at the map for another long moment. Then he nodded once, the way he always nodded when he had already decided and just needed a second to close the door on every other option. "When do we move?" he asked. "You already are," Yuna said. Myra found out about the strike mission when Tiang told the full bridge crew at 600 the next morning. He laid it out in plain language without drama. Their fleet was going into Voakai space. Their targets were not warships. They were the stations, depots, and relay points that the armada depended on. The goal was disruption, not destruction of lives where avoidable. Get in, take apart the infrastructure, get out. He asked if anyone had questions. Nobody did. The crew went back to their stations. Myra sat with it for a while. Going into Volkai territory felt different from waiting in the outer solar system. Waiting had a kind of safety to it even when it didn't, the safety of familiar ground underfoot. This was something else. This was going somewhere that belonged to something that had just sent 1,400 ships to erase her planet. She thought about saying something to Tiang. She thought about it and then decided against it. He would tell her to focus. She already knew that. She focused. The strike fleet crossed into Volkai territory on the fourth cycle after departure. They moved in tight groups, dark and quiet, using the same low-emission approach that had kept the main fleet hidden beyond Pluto for years. The Volkai Home Defense Force had not been built for this. It had been built for a conventional military assault coming from a known direction. It was not built for contacts that appeared close before they should have been possible, struck fast, and were gone before a full response could form. Diho ran the engagement from the fleet command carrier. Tiang's Undying moved at the front of each strike rotation. The first target was a massive fuel processing station sitting at the edge of the Volkai inner system, the single largest supplier of drive fuel to the Armada's transit chain. It was defended by a ring of automated platforms and 2 escort vessels. Sungho's weapons systems dealt with the platforms in under 3 minutes. The escort vessels broke and ran. Then the strike group went to work on the station itself, not blowing it apart, but taking out its processing core, its fuel transfer arrays, its communication dishes, all the working parts that made it a station rather than a large piece of metal sitting in space. Myra watched on her display as the station went dark section by section. It looked strange, quieter than the battle had been, more deliberate. She asked Diho once, during a brief window between strike rotations, whether it felt different hitting something that wasn't shooting back. Diho thought about it seriously, which she had not entirely expected. "It feels like work," he said. "That's what it's supposed to feel like." They hit 11 targets in 8 cycles: fuel stations, communication arrays, 3 large repair docks that had been prepositioned along the Armada's return route, a command relay hub that tied together the Volkai fleet's long-range coordination network. Each one went dark the same way the first one had, section by section, lights out, systems down. The Volkai Home Defense Force tried to respond. They pulled ships from 3 different patrol zones and pushed them toward the strike fleet's last known positions. Diho let them chase positions that were already empty and was somewhere else entirely by the time they arrived. Back at the edge of the human solar system, Yuna was doing exactly what she had said she would do, holding. The Volkai Armada was still in transit, still enormous, still coming. But the reports filtering back through the intelligence channels showed something changing inside it. Supply requests going unanswered. Communication windows that should have opened and didn't. Ships in the rear of the formation beginning to drop speed as their fuel reserves started running lower than projected. The Armada was a machine. Diho was removing its parts while it was still running. Yuna's defensive fleet engaged the Armada's forward scouts in a series of quick, hard strikes at the outer system's edge. No full engagement. She would not fight 1,400 ships head-on even with everything she had. She hit the scouts hard, pulled back, appeared somewhere else, hit again. She made the Armada's advance elements cautious and slow. She cost them time, and time cost them fuel they were no longer receiving. At the Galactic Conclave, things were becoming difficult for Nari. 3 Volkai allied species demanded an emergency session. They stood before the full assembly and accused humanity of disproportionate aggression. They said the strikes on Volkai infrastructure went beyond defense. They said the conclave had to intervene. Nari was given the floor. She stood at the podium and looked out at 60 species watching her, some afraid, some angry, some curious, and she spoke in the same calm voice she always used, the one that gave away nothing except that she was absolutely certain of what she was saying. She talked for 20 minutes. She used history. She used numbers. She explained what the Volkai Armada would do to Earth if it reached the solar system intact, and she explained what humanity was doing to prevent that, and she explained why every choice her people were making was designed to end the war faster and with fewer dead on every side than any other option available. She did not apologize. "We did not begin this," she said at the end. "We are ending it as efficiently as we know how, and we know how very well." The Conclave did not intervene. On the 8th cycle of the strike campaign, Diho's fleet completed its last objective and turned for home. Sung-Ho walked the weapons deck doing a quiet inventory. Tiang stood at his viewport on the bridge and looked back at the direction they had come from, at the Volkai space they were leaving behind them. 11 targets, dark, gone, done. He opened a channel to Yuna. "The lights are out," Diho said. Yuna's voice came back after a short pause. She sounded the same as she always sounded, level and clear, and giving nothing away. But Myra, standing at her station on the bridge, thought she heard something underneath it, something like the exhale of a person who had been holding their breath for a very long time. "Then let's go knock on their door," Yuna said. The Volkai Armada was dying slowly, and it knew it. It was still enormous. Even fractured and starving for fuel and cut off from its relay network, 1,400 warships moving through space was a sight that had no equal in the modern galaxy. But a fleet was not just ships. It was the people running them, the fuel feeding them, the communication lines tying them together into something that thought and moved as one. Strip those things away and what was left was not an armada. It was a crowd. A very large, very dangerous crowd that was beginning to lose its shape. Yuna watched the armada's cohesion deteriorate on the main display in the Seoul Command Center. The rear third of the formation had lost contact with the command vessels at the front. Ships that should have been moving in coordinated patterns were bunching, drifting, slowing. The great forward push that had looked so certain 20 cycles ago was becoming something that looked, to a trained eye, like controlled confusion becoming something less controlled. She gave the order to stop holding and start pushing. The defensive fleet that had been bleeding the Armada's advance elements for days hit the forward formation with its full weight. At the same time, Diho's strike fleet came out of its return transit and swung wide around the Armada's flank, cutting off the retreat corridor. The Armada was between them, in front, behind, and on both sides. Not surrounded, not yet, but close enough that the difference was academic. The High Executor's flagship was in the Armada's center, which had felt like the safest place when the transit began, and now felt like the inside of a closing hand. He had been awake for 30 cycles. His staff had stopped giving him reports that started with good news because there was no good news to start with. Fuel reserves across the fleet were at levels that should not have been possible this early in a campaign. The communication network that was supposed to tie his fleet together was full of gaps and silences where relay stations used to be. Ships in the rear were requesting instructions they could not receive. Ships in the front were taking damage they could not repair because the repair docks behind them were dark and empty. He had sent 1,400 ships to remove a small, quiet civilization from the edge of galactic space. He had done it with the same calm certainty he had brought to 16 other campaigns across 4 centuries. He had read the reports on humanity. He had seen their small fleet numbers and their single inhabited world and their brief, noisy history of fighting each other. He had assessed them and found them manageable. He understood now, sitting in the silence of his command bridge with the tactical display showing him things he did not want to see, that he had read the reports correctly and understood them completely wrong. He had seen a species that fought and concluded they were defined by their losses. He had not considered that they were defined by what they learned from them. The message arrived on his command screen without announcement. It came on every Volkai channel, every allied frequency, and every open conclave band simultaneously. A human face appeared on the display. A woman, dark-haired, with a uniform that had no decorations on it and eyes that were looking directly at him the way a person looked at something they had already decided about. She spoke in Volkai, clear and correct Volkai, with no translation lag, which meant someone on her side had spent a great deal of time learning his language for exactly this moment. Yuna had practiced the speech twice. That was enough. She told the High Executor that the war was over. She said it simply, as a fact and not an opinion. She laid out the terms in clear language. The Volkai Dominion would stand down its military forces to a defensive threshold only. The 12 species currently under Volkai control would be brought before the Galactic Conclave for self-determination hearings. All expansion into human space would end permanently. And the record of this war, every detail of it from declaration to conclusion, would be entered into the Conclave's permanent historical archive, so that every species in the galaxy would know exactly what had happened here. She was not angry when she said it. There was no heat in her voice. She spoke the way someone spoke when they were reading something true aloud. "You declared war," she said at the end. "We replied, we hope you are listening now." She ended the transmission. The bridge was quiet. Diho stood to her left. The staff at their stations waited. Somewhere out past Pluto, Tiang's Undying sat at the head of the First Fleet in the darkness of Volkai home space, engines running, weapons ready, waiting for the answer. The High Executor sat with the terms for a long time. He was not a creature who surrendered. His people had not surrendered in 400 years because they had not needed to. The concept lived in their language as something that happened to others, to the smaller and the weaker and the ones who had not prepared well enough. He turned the word over now and found it fit in his mouth in a way he had not expected, not comfortably, but accurately. He thought about the declaration he had sent 61 cycles ago. He thought about how certain he had been. He thought about the small woman who had received it at the conclave table and asked politely to be excused to pass the message along. He thought about the signal that had come back. Finally, he understood now what that word had meant. It had not been relief. It had not been fear mislabeled. It had been the sound of something that had been waiting patiently for a very long time finally being allowed to move. He authorized the surrender. Nari was at the conclave podium when the confirmation came through. The room had been in session for hours, tense and loud, with species arguing over outcomes and implications, and what the end of this war meant for the balance of power across the galaxy. When the official Volkai surrender signal registered on the conclave's central system, the room went silent the way rooms only went silent when something happened that nobody had a prepared response for. Nari looked at the confirmation on her screen. She looked up at the 60 species watching her. She saw wariness in a lot of faces. She saw something close to awe in a few. She saw one ambassador near the back who was doing mental calculations very quickly about everything he had assumed about humanity up until about 10 minutes ago. An ambassador near the front leaned forward and asked her quietly whether her people had ever truly been afraid. Nari thought about it honestly, the way the question deserved. "Of course we were," she said, "but we were ready. We have been ready for a long time. We just did not want to be the ones who started it." She closed her screen and began gathering her things. There was paperwork to file. There were peace documents to draft. There was a great deal of quiet, careful work ahead, and she was good at quiet, careful work. Myra stood at the viewport on the bridge of the Undying and looked down at the Volkai homeworld below. It was large and pale gold in color, wrapped in thin white cloud, not so different from other worlds she had seen on maps and screens. It looked, from up here, like something that could be reasoned with, like something that had simply made a very serious mistake. Tiang came to stand beside her. For a while neither of them said anything. She asked him the question she had been carrying since the beginning. She asked why it had come to this at all. Why not talk? Why not negotiate? Why had 30 years of trying to be seen by the galaxy ended with a war instead of a conversation? Tiang was quiet for a moment. He looked at the planet below them. "We tried," he said. "For 30 years we sent people and signals and proposals. We asked to be included. We asked to be heard." He paused. "They looked at us and saw something they could remove, something too small and too noisy to matter." Another pause. "Sometimes the only language something understands is the one it speaks first." Myra looked at the planet for a while longer. Then she looked at the stars beyond it, at the enormous quiet of space in every direction, at the galaxy that had watched all of this happen, and was now going to have to decide what it thought about humanity going forward. She thought that was probably going to be an interesting conversation. The command center in Seoul was almost empty by the time Yuna came back to it. The war was over. The staff had been dismissed in rotations over the past few hours. The holographic star maps were shutting down one by one as the systems were put back into standby, the bright network of fleet positions and battle coordinates fading out of the air, until there was nothing left but a large, quiet room and the last few screens running their final logs. Diho was still there. He had 2 cups of coffee and he handed one to Yuna when she walked in. She took it. Outside the buried windows, if you could call them windows, the low morning light of Seoul was starting to come through the ventilation feeds. Somewhere above them the Han River was catching it. They stood there for a moment without speaking, which was something they had always been comfortable doing. So Diho said, "What now?" Yuna looked at the last star map still running on the far wall. The galaxy, wide and deep and very quiet. All those species out there recalibrating what they knew. All those civilizations that had watched humanity wait and prepare and then move, fast and certain and without cruelty, and were now sitting with the memory of it. "Now we make sure they remember," she said, "and we go back to being people." She drank her coffee. The map went dark.